let's talk about welfare with slides. Um, Now, the reason that I wanted to do slides is because it seemed like the easiest way of portraying all of the graphs and stuff that I needed to portray for this video, and I'm not very good at editing videos, so here we are, I guess. It's like that famous Bill O'Reilly quote, "Fuck it, we're doing slides." Um, But the basic format of this video is going to be, I'm going to go over why welfare is necessary. I'm going to go over data on how effective it is. And then I'm going to address some of the most common objections to the idea of welfare that is made by conservatives and libertarians and such. So the thing that's crucially important to understand when we're talking about why welfare is necessary is what I like to call the distribution problem. Essentially, a market economy distributes resources based solely on the marginal productivity of each unit of capital and labor. The problem is approximately half of the population does not work or own a considerable amount of capital, and therefore is not distributed any resources through market mechanisms. And here we can see, based on census data, the population, the percentage of the population who works is 51%. The percentage of the population who doesn't work is 49%. So when we talk about so given this problem, right? Given the problem of the fact that markets don't distribute any resources to like half the population, if we are to avoid dooming massive swaths of the population to poverty, there are three potential solutions. One, we could push the non-working population into the workforce so they are earning a market income. Two, we could rely on private charity to provide resources for those who aren't earning a market income. And three, we could implement welfare, through which the state allocates economic resources to those who don't make a market income through taxation. So let's assess the first solution I mentioned. The first possible solution is pushing the non-working population into the workforce somehow. However, this solution is obviously very suboptimal, given that the vast majority of the non-working population is comprised of people who are not only not working, but shouldn't be working. So 45% of the non-working population is children, 25% of the non-working population is elderly, 9.8% of the non-working population is disabled people, 5.9% of the non-working population is students, 7.8% of the non-working population is caretakers who are, taking care of like a family member who's, maybe sick or disabled or something. So, needless to say, we probably don't, if you're a morally decent human being, you probably don't want a society where we're forcing children and 90-year-olds and people with serious disabilities and students who need to be focusing on their schoolwork and caretakers who need to be focusing on taking care of like family members. These are probably not people who a decent society would be forcing to get a job in order to not live in poverty. The second solution, if we don't want, forced child labor and elderly labor and so on, is to rely on private charity to distribute resources to those who aren't distributed any by the market. The problem with relying on private charity is that it's just not very effective. So if we look at the poverty level by private social spending, we can see that the correlation between net private social spending and post-transfer poverty rates is an R-squared correlation of 0, i.e. charity does not have any observable effect whatsoever on poverty rates. Contrast private social spending, i.e. charity, to public social spending, i.e. welfare, and we see that welfare much more effectively decreases poverty, whereas the R-squared correlation between charity and poverty was 0. The R-squared correlation between welfare and poverty is 0.4, which is significant. Additionally, if we want to look more into the effectiveness of welfare, look at these two graphs. So the first graph is the population composition of every market income percentile. The second one is the population composition of every disposable market income percentile. So market income is before we take into account the influences of taxes and welfare, and the disposable income is after we take that into account. So we see that before taking into account welfare, elderly people make up over 40% of the very bottom market income percentile. However, after we take into account welfare, things like Social Security going to old people, the elderly make up about like 10% or 15% of the bottom income percentile. Similarly, disabled people, I think that's like 30%, make up 30% of the bottom market income percentile, but only about 10% of the bottom disposable income percentile. Unemployed people as well become significantly less overrepresented in terms of disposable income percentile versus market income percentile. So basically what this goes to show is that welfare policies do a very effective job at distributing resources to people who aren't making them through market mechanisms, and bettering the circumstances of these groups of people, elderly people, unemployed people, children, disabled people, etc. If we want to look at, in the U.S., the impact that welfare has on poverty, if you look at the number of people who are in poverty in terms of their market income, that number is 77.9 million people. However, after taking into account welfare, that number goes down to 42.4 million people. If we look at the poverty gap based on market income and disposable income, the poverty gap being how much money on the aggregate people below the poverty line are making below the poverty line. The poverty gap in terms of market income is $511.7 billion. The poverty gap in terms of disposable income is $172.6 billion. So not only is welfare effective at decreasing poverty, but even for the people who it doesn't bring above the poverty line, it does significant good in bettering their circumstance within the poverty line. Additionally, if we look at poverty rates before taxes and transfers and after taxes and transfers internationally, we see that the U.S., for example, in terms of its market income, is on the lower side of market income poverty rates. However, after we take into account taxes and transfers, the United States has the highest poverty rate because it has the lowest or the smallest welfare state. So even though the United States' welfare state does a lot of damage on decreasing poverty and decreasing the poverty gap, it's also true that it is so small that it shoots from one of the less impoverished nations to the most impoverished nation among OECD countries because other countries have even bigger welfare states than the U.S. According to a 2017 study titled "The Scandinavian Fantasy: The Sources of Intergenerational Mobility in Denmark and the U.S., intergenerational mobility essentially determines the extent to which people are able to move up the income bracket in society as compared to where their parents were at. Income mobility is the same in Denmark as it is in the U.S. before taking redistributive policies into account. But after taking redistributive policies into account, Denmark's income mobility is significantly higher because it has more welfare. So essentially, given the distribution problem that I've laid out, we are faced with a choice between three possible societies. In the first society, we rely on private charity to distribute resources to those with no market income, and therefore massive swaths of people are therefore doomed to charity, or doomed to poverty, because we've seen charity doesn't do an effective job at decreasing poverty. In the second society, we decrease poverty by forcing children, disabled people, elderly people, caretakers, etc. into the workforce, which obviously is quite dystopian shit. In the third society, we simply address poverty by providing welfare to people who aren't earning a market income. I'll leave it up to your intuition. I would say that any morally decent person can very clearly see what the preferable society would be. So one of the most common objections to the idea of welfare is that welfare is bad because it disincentivizes work and allocates money to people who live off welfare with no intention of re-entering the workforce. Essentially, the argument is like, if we give poor people welfare, then they just become addicted to the system and they become complacent in being poor, and they won't want to go out and find a job because they're just living off of welfare. However, this doesn't seem to be borne out empirically. In a comprehensive program-by-program study on different welfare policies titled, quote, "An Assessment of the Effectiveness of Anti-Poverty Programs in the United States," unquote, researchers Ben Shalom, Robert Moffat, and John Schultz found that supposed work disincentive effects of welfare have, quote-unquote, basically zero effect on the overall poverty rate. Additionally, according to data from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, over 9/10 of the entitlement benefit spending, ignore the typo, goes to elderly, disabled, or working households. So contrary to the idea that we're just giving all this money to welfare queens who sit around living off of welfare because they don't want to find a job, almost all of our welfare spending goes to people who are working or can't work. According to a paper, sort of making the same point, according to a paper titled Balancing Paychecks and Public Assistance from the Economic Policy Institute, about 2/3 of welfare recipients are either working or have a family member who is working, and about half of welfare recipients work full-time. According to a variety of studies and analyses by economist and data scientist Gareth Olds, who released studies on this issue like food stamp entrepreneurs, entrepreneurship and the social safety net, and so on, welfare programs can be shown to increase the level of entrepreneurship. This is largely because welfare reduces people's risk, i.e., if I want to go out and leave my job and start a business, but I'm afraid, well, what if I do that and then it doesn't pan out and then I can't feed my children? Well, having food stamps sets a good floor to say, hey, look, even if your business fails, you're still going to be able to feed your children, like that kind of thing. And additionally, it increases people's ability to save for investment, obviously, by giving them more means of consumption. So, contrary to the idea that welfare, makes people lazy, we can actually see that welfare makes people more productive in the sense that it makes them more likely to start up a business. Additionally, psychological literature reveals that positive psychological states, such as happiness, result in wider and richer momentary thought-action repertoires. This is theorized to be one of the primary reasons why researchers found a positive causal relationship between social spending and innovation across OECD countries in a 2019 paper titled Innovation and Welfare, the Marriage of an Unlikely Couple. So essentially the idea here is that when people are happier, they have a greater ability to adapt to their surroundings in more diverse and innovative ways. And this can be seen through a variety of experiments cited in the 2019 paper. And so giving people welfare, which increases their happiness and their positive psychological state by, decreasing their stress and so on, because obviously, being able to eat probably makes you less stress. Welfare actually makes people more likely to be innovative rather than, less likely to be productive, as this argument would posit. Another common argument which is frequently made against having a large welfare state is that growing the size of government through high taxation and social spending will lead to more government overreach and government corruption. However, this argument is not particularly well-founded. So the 10 least corrupt countries in the world, according to the Transparency International's ranking, on average collect 23.64% of their GDP in taxes, while the 10 most corrupt countries for which there is data available collect on average 14.5% of their GDP in taxes, according to World Bank data. Central government expenditure as a percentage of GDP is twice as large in the 10 least corrupt countries, 20.75%, compared to the 10 most corrupt countries, 10.45%, for which there is data, obviously. Even if we take the whole world as a sample size, there is a positive correlation between government size and institutional quality. The correlation between total tax revenues as a share of GDP and institutional quality, which is sort of a measure of corruption, is 0.34. Additionally, the correlation between total government consumption as a share of GDP and institutional quality is 0.39. The two least corrupt countries in sub-Saharan Africa, that being Botswana and Mauritius, probably completely butchered that name, but we're moving on. Show must go on. Have disproportionately large public sectors, welfare states, central government expenditures as a percentage of GDP, and prominent socialist parties in government, which advocate for obviously big social spending and so on, compared to the rest of the sub-Saharan African region. In a paper titled "It's My Money, Why Big Government May Be Good Government," researchers Anna Persson and Bo Rothstein theorized that the consistently found correlation between bigger government and less corruption is a product of the fact that when more of people's money is being taxed and spent by the government, they're more incentivized to keep the government in check and pay attention to its affairs. Kind of like, hey, you're taking my money, what are you doing with it? I'm going to make sure to keep you in check. So, the final argument that I'm going to get into is the argument that essentially by increasing the ability of single women to sustain themselves without the need for marriage, decreases the incentive for marriage and therefore increases rates of single motherhood, which is bad for children, bad for communities, etc. Another version of this argument is that means-tested welfare functions as a marginal tax rate on new earnings, and since marriage is financially beneficial, disincentivizes marriage. Welfare disincentivizes marriage. So it's important to note that right off the bat, the second argument isn't an argument against welfare, it's an argument against means-tested welfare. And progressives generally support, myself included, universal welfare policies rather than means-tested welfare policies, precisely because means-tested welfare policies can function as a marginal tax rate, which has higher deadweight loss, as opposed to, I don't want to get into that tangent, but essentially, regardless of the fact that it's only an argument against means testing, not like all welfare, it doesn't seem to be, neither of these arguments seem to be empirically borne out, because they both make testable predictions which aren't successfully found, which is that if this argument was correct, then welfare could be shown to increase single motherhood. So originally, this view was thought to have empirical grounding because there seemed to be a correlation between more generous welfare available to single mothers and single motherhood. However, the problem with using these correlations as evidence is that this correlation is very likely to be spurious due to the fact that areas with more single mothers are more likely to pass more generous benefits available to single mothers, and areas which have cultures that are more accepting of single motherhood are more likely to pass more generous benefits for single mothers, obviously. So this might not be this might be single motherhood and generous welfare happen to be concurrent with one another because they're caused by a similar underlying factor without welfare itself causing more single motherhood. In a study titled Welfare Effects on Female Headship with Area Effects, Robert Moffat found that when controlling for these confounding factors, the relationship between welfare and single motherhood disappears for white people but remains for black people. However, in a follow-up study titled Does Welfare Play Any Role in Female Headship Decisions, Hilary Hoynes found that the impact of welfare on black single motherhood disappears as well when controlling for migration, which essentially means that welfare generosity does not cause single motherhood in black communities, but rather people are more likely to become single mothers, or people who are more likely to become single mothers choose to move to states with better benefits. In another study titled Welfare in America, Is Welfare the Answer or the Problem?, researchers Summers and David Elwood show that welfare benefits could not play a major role in the rise of out-of-wedlock births because welfare benefits rose significantly in the 1960s, only to fall in the 70s and 80s, which is the period when out-of-wedlock births rose most sharply. Yeah, that's and basically in conclusion, welfare plays an absolutely necessary function that no other mechanism can fulfill. Welfare empirically is remarkably effective at decreasing income inequality, decreasing poverty, decreasing the poverty gap, increasing income mobility, all of which are obviously very good things. And the most common objections to welfare all tend not to be borne out whatsoever empirically. So basically, in conclusion, welfare good. Obligatory shout out to my $10 patrons, Cade, Alex, Daniel, Benny, Isocratic, Liam the Commie, and Hate Corruption. If you want to subscribe to my Patreon, I write all sorts of exclusive essays about similar topics that I talk about on my YouTube channel. I'm currently writing one responding to this homophobic dude named Mike Winger, who released a video about the secular case for homophobia or whatever, which is pretty, it's going to be pretty fun. So anyways, subscribe to my Patreon if you want to, is the point. Goodbye.